Everyone feared the giant Apache in the cage until she wrapped him in her wedding veil. Joanne stood at the edge of the dusty town square, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rickety wooden stalls. Before her, a crude iron cage held a hulking figure, an Apache warrior so tall and broad-shouldering that the crowd dared not meet his eyes. His dark hair fell in braids, his skin dusted with red earth, and his wrists were raw, where the manacles bit into his flesh. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. They called him a monster, a killer, but Joanne saw only pain and exhaustion. She remembered her late husband's final words, sewn into her wedding veil. "See the good no one else can." Now that veil slipped from her shoulders, and she approached the cage with measured steps. The murmurs grew into jeers, but she clutched her savings pouch at her waist, steeling herself against ridicule. "Please," she said, her voice steady, "let me buy him." The jailer laughed, a harsh, grating sound. But when Joanne laid down every coin she had earned as seamstress for the past 6 months, his sneer faltered. He unlocked the padlock with a metallic click that echoed through the square. As the cage door swung open, the giant Apache did not lunge. He simply blinked, as if surprised that someone outside his own people might show mercy. Joanne draped her white veil across his massive shoulders. The cloth was fine, almost delicate against his battle-scarred frame, but she wrapped it firmly, making sure it would stay, her symbol of faith in the man no one else dared defend. The crowd recoiled, but she did not waver. Together, she and the freed warrior walked through the silent throng, the veil fluttering in the breeze, an unspoken promise of something neither had yet dared to name. The night air settled over the small adobe house as Joanne guided Kokum inside, his massive frame nearly touching the low ceiling. Flickering lantern light revealed the deep groove across his shoulder, the wound still raw and angry. Despite the pain, he made no sound. Instead, he watched her every move with careful, wary eyes. Joanne laid out a clean blanket near the hearth, then removed her wedding veil and dipped it into a basin of warm water. The scent of lavender soap eased the tension in her shoulders. As she knelt before him, Kokum's breath came in shallow, rasping gulps, each inhale a testament to his survival instinct. She pressed the damp veil against the cut, gently patting away dried blood. His skin trembled under the delicate fabric. Though fierce and silent in the cage, here he was vulnerable, trusting her entirely. A soft moan escaped him, caught between relief and regret for the violence that had brought him here. "Shh," she whispered, brushing stray strands of his dark hair from his brow. "You're safe now." His deep eyes, rimmed with pain, flickered with something like gratitude. For a moment, the barrier between prisoner and protector vanished. The veil, once a symbol of her own loss, had become an emblem of his hope. In the corner, a wooden chest creaked as the wind rattled the shutters. Outside, coyotes howled, but inside, time seemed to stand still. Joanne hummed a lullaby her mother once sang, a melody of distant prairies and promised reunions. Kokum's tense muscles relaxed enough for him to close his eyes, surrendering to a rest he had not known since the day he was taken. Joanne watched him sleep, the veil draped across his shoulder like a sacred cloak. She vowed to unravel the lies that had bound him, to show the townsfolk the man behind the legend. And as dawn approached, she wrapped the veil around her own shoulders, steeling herself for the challenges ahead. Joanne led Kokum back into the square at dawn's pale light. The jailer watched with greedy interest as she approached the unlocked cage once more, pouch in hand. Word had spread. The timid seamstress was ready to spend her savings on a man deemed dangerous. A hush fell over the onlookers, some curious, others outraged. "Name your price," the jailer sneered, thumb hooked in his belt. Joanne offered each coin with quiet resolve. "Every cent I have," she said. "He deserves a chance." The jailer's scowl wavered as he counted the silver. He glanced at Kokum, who stood motionless, head bowed but eyes alert. At last, with a reluctant shrug, the jailer tossed the pouch at Joanne's feet and jerked open the cage door. The Apache refrained from bursting forth. His movements were controlled, as if gauging her intent. Joanne stepped forward and draped the wedding veil once more over his broad shoulders, tying its delicate ends at his chest. The white fabric contrasted with his weathered skin and the coarse rope still looping his wrists. She offered him her hand. He hesitated, then bowed his head and placed his massive palm in hers. A collective gasp arose from the crowd, the touch of mercy between two unlikely allies. Together, they walked toward the outskirts, passing shallow storefronts and dusty wagons. Kokoum's frame brushed against low wooden beams. He allowed the veil to catch on the jagged edge, then slowly adjusted it until it rested like a mantle across his back. As they reached the old granary behind the general store, Joanne guided him inside. She pulled a length of rope from her satchel and gently removed his manacles. The jailer's crude locks fell away with a click, leaving ridges on Kokoum's wrists. He flexed his fingers, testing their freedom, and then folded his arms across his chest in quiet contemplation. Joanne pressed a hand to his shoulder. "You're free, Kokoum. Now you decide what comes next." His eyes flicked toward the door, where townsfolk had gathered, their expressions torn between suspicion and awe. He straightened, gathering strength in his stance. With deliberate care, he lifted the veil and bowed his head to Joanne in gratitude. Outside, the jailer shrugged and pocketed the coins. The audience dispersed, whispering tales of a seamstress who dared to buy a warrior's life. Joanne watched Kokoum adjust to his newfound freedom, the veil fluttering as a silent banner of hope. In that moment, both understood that the true transaction had transcended silver. It was an exchange of trust and the promise of redemption. At first light, Joanne guided Kokoum through narrow side streets toward her little workshop. The morning air held a chill that bit at exposed skin, but Kokoum did not flinch. His towering frame ducked beneath low eaves, drawing startled gasps from chimney sweeps and milkmaids. Whispers trailed their passage. "What madness! She'll be killed." Inside the workshop, bolts of wool and cotton lined the walls. Joanne set to work at her sewing table, fingers deftly cutting fabric as Kokoum leaned against the doorjamb, arms folded. He watched her in silence, his fierce gaze softening each time her needle threaded a pattern. A knock sounded at the front door. Joanne frowned, glancing at Kokoum. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, and she opened the door to reveal Mrs. Carver, the town gossip. "Joanne!" Mrs. Carver huffed, eyeing the giant silhouette behind her friend. "People are talking. They say you harbor a murderer." Joanne lifted her chin. "He's no killer. He was framed." Mrs. Carver's lips thinned. "You risk everything, your reputation, your safety on an Apache?" Kokoum stepped forward, even bent at the knees to enter. His height loomed. Mrs. Carver gasped, stumbling back. Joanne shot Kokoum an apologetic glance as he offered a gentle nod to the older woman. "Don't fear him," Joanne said softly. "He saved me from despair." Suspicion flickered in Mrs. Carver's eyes, replaced by reluctant curiosity. She peered at Kokoum's wounded shoulder, at the white veil draped across his back. "Is it true," she whispered, "that you spared his life and he protects yours?" Kokoum inclined his head. His voice, when it came, was low and measured. "She gave me mercy. I repay kindness." Mrs. Carver swallowed. "I'll keep your secret for now." After she left, silence settled once more. Kokoum's gaze met Joanne's. In those dark pools, she saw both gratitude and a question. What would come next? Joanne returned to her sewing, crafting a garment larger than any she had made, designed to fit Kokoum's massive frame. Each stitch spoke of trust, each fold of fabric a safeguard. Outside, the town's murmurs swelled like an approaching storm. Yet inside the humble workshop, a fragile peace reigned, a bond woven from compassion and courage, fragile as the veil that bound them. Dawn's first light filtered through the dust-coated window pane as Joanne adjusted the bandaged shoulder of Kokoum. The makeshift infirmary was little more than a corner of her workshop. An old wooden chair for him to sit on, jars of herbs and salves she had learned to prepare from leather-bound medical guides, and the scent of fresh linen drying on the line. Kokum sat with his arms crossed, enduring the stinging burn of iodine and the brush of clean cotton. His deep brown eyes reflected equal parts gratitude and stoicism. Each application of the antiseptic elicited a sharp inhale, but he did not wince audibly. Joanne's hands trembled slightly as she traced the edges of the wound, careful not to reopen healing flesh. "I've never seen such resilience," she murmured. "You hold your pain like a shield." He looked at her, his gaze softer than she had ever seen. When he spoke, his voice was raspy from dehydration. "You give me strength," he replied. "Your faith is my remedy." They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant calls of market traders preparing for the day's commerce. Kokum's breathing steadied as the salve soaked into his shoulder, soothing the raw tissue. Joanne sank beside him, eyes on his face. "Rest now," she said. "Tomorrow we'll explore the land beyond the ridge. Find allies who will believe your story." He inclined his head in agreement, though his expression held a shadow of concern. "Some fear me," he whispered. "Others will try to capture me again." She smiled softly. "As long as you have me, and this veil," she tapped the white cloth draped over his chest, "no one will see you merely as a monster." Kokum traced the veil with a finger. "It is more than cloth," he said, voice low. "It is a promise." Joanne nodded, and together they sat as dawn turned to morning, forging a bond as enduring as the rugged landscape that surrounded them. Outside the workshop, the wind carried news of their secret. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones of a seamstress who tended a feared Apache warrior. Yet inside, healing and hope coalesced in the quiet hum of compassion, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could bind two souls with unbreakable resolve. Night had fallen by the time Kokum stirred from uneasy sleep. Moonlight filtered through the cracked shutters of the workshop, casting pale beams on his scarred form. Joanne, long since retired to her small cot, sat up at the sound of his soft groans. She crossed the room and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. He shivered, eyes clouded with memories he could not escape. "Dream," he rasped, voice thick with pain. "Chains, fire, voices." Joanne guided him to a sturdy chair by the dying embers of the hearth. She fetched a bowl of warm water and cloth, her movements calm and deliberate. As she cleaned the sweat from his brow, Kokum closed his eyes and spoke of flames that consumed his village, of screams drowned under the collapse of burning huts. "They called me giant," he whispered, "said I would crush them. My strength was their terror." She paused, heart tight. "They feared what they couldn't understand," she murmured. "But you survived. You're here now." Kokum's breath shook as he sank into memory. "I could not save them," he admitted. "My chains held me while they fell." Tears pricked Joanne's eyes. This was the man behind the legend, a protector unbound by steel, yet bound by guilt. She reached into her apron and drew the wedding veil, now smoothed and clean. Gently, she pressed its edge to his forehead. "In my world," she said softly, "a veil is not only for weddings. It shields, it comforts. Let it remind you of mercy." He opened his eyes. In their depths, she saw sorrow and a spark of something else, hope. He nodded once, pressing his palm over the white silk. They sat in shared silence as the night deepened. Outside, the wind whispered through the desert grass, a solitary coyote's howl echoing against adobe walls. Inside, two souls armored by loss found solace in fragile acts of kindness. When Kokum's breathing steadied, Joanne tucked the veil around his shoulders like a cloak. He rose unsteadily, offering his arm to steady her. Together, they moved toward the small window, looking out at the sliver of moon above the ridge. "In the morning," he said, voice firm, "we face the world anew." She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Together." she agreed. And as they watched the night sky, the past's shadows loosened their grip, if only for a moment, illuminated by the promise woven into a simple piece of cloth. The morning sun pierced through gaps in the workshop shutters as Joanne and Kokum prepared to face the next trial. Word had spread that the powerful rancher, Silas Creedy, intended to reclaim the Apache prize and punish the seamstress for her defiance. His name carried weight, vast herds, boundless land, and a private militia of hardened cowhands. Joanne stepped outside first, her heart pounding. Kokum followed, the white wedding veil draped like a banner across his back. They crossed the dusty lane toward Creedy's homestead, a sprawling ranch with weathered barns and corrals echoing with lowing cattle. As they approached, the rancher emerged from a porch high above, supported by 2 men-at-arms. He stood tall in polished boots, his Stetson tilted back to reveal a hawkish stare. "Joanne Dawson," he called, voice carrying over the yard. "You've meddled where none should tread." His gaze shifted to Kokum. "And you, Apache, belong behind bars, or better yet, on your knees." Joanne squared her shoulders. "He belongs nowhere but free, Silas. You framed him to protect your stolen land, and you're the murderer." A murmur ran through Creedy's men. He sneered. "Bold words for a widow. Let's see how bold you are when this savage decides to repay your kindness with blood." Kokum stepped forward, every muscle coiled like a spring. The rancher's men reached for rifles, but their guns wavered. Kokum's eyes, deep and unwavering, met theirs. In that silence, fear spread. Memories of the giant in the cage, the mercy of the veil, and the tender care of Joanne surfaced in their minds. Silas spat onto the dirt. "Then let him show us." A tense moment held the world still. Then Kokum raised his hand, not in aggression, but in peace. He bowed his head to Joanne, who nodded in encouragement. He spoke in his low, measured voice. "You threatened her life. I defend what is right." He took a single, deliberate step toward Creedy. The rancher's militia flinched, their rifles clattered as they lowered bipods. Kokum's presence filled the space, no longer a beast to fear, but a guardian of justice. Creedy's lips curled into a snarl. He reached for a pistol at his hip, but before he could draw, Kokum's massive hand closed around the barrel. The rancher's weapon flew upward, spinning from his grasp. With quiet force, Kokum pushed him back against a fence rail. Joanne rushed forward, placing a hand on Kokum's arm. "Enough," she said. "He's seen mercy. He'll receive justice." Silas Creedy, chest heaving, glared at the pair. Around him, his cowhands dropped their rifles. The rancher straightened, dusting his coat. "This isn't over," he growled, but there was defeat in his voice. As Creedy retreated, Joanne released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Kokum folded the veil over his fist and offered it to her. She took it with a grateful smile. Together they stood amid the scattering men, 2 unlikely allies, whose bond had turned fear into respect, one courageous act at a time. The night air carried a faint chill as Joanne and Kokum returned to the granary behind the general store. Flames from a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows against the weathered wood. The townsfolk were asleep. Only the distant howl of coyotes broke the silence. Yet Joanne felt every rustle of straw, every creak of the hinges, as if danger lurked in every corner. Inside, the granary smelled of oats and old hay. Joanne set the lantern on a barrel, its light revealing Kokum's thoughtful expression. His wound had healed enough for him to move freely, but the memory of chains still lingered in his posture. He paced slowly, boots sinking into loose straw, while Joanne gathered supplies, a few blankets, a water skin, and the wedding veil, now folded neatly. "They may strike at dawn," Joanne whispered. "Silas won't let go so easily." She met Kokum's gaze. "We need to protect each other, whatever comes." He nodded solemnly. "I will stand for you, as you stood for me." His voice was low, but unwavering. In that moment, the giant Apache ceased to be a figure of fear. He became a guardian whose loyalty surpassed any oath a man could swear. Joanne fastened the veil around Kokum's neck like a scarf, its white silk a stark contrast against the darkness. Each fold reminded them of the mercy that had bound their fates. She laid the blankets at the far end of the granary and motioned for Kokum to rest. He crouched on the floor, blade of grass in hand, as she smoothed a blanket over him. Outside, horses stirred in their stalls, sensing the tension. Joanne settled against a stack of grain sacks, sleeping roll at her side. She listened to Kokum's even breaths, feeling safer with his presence. At the first hint of dawn, Joanne awoke to muffled voices. She peered through a gap in the barn door. Silas Creedy and 2 of his henchmen were advancing, rifles at the ready. Her heart raced, but she held her ground. Kokum rose silently beside her, the veil trailing from his shoulders like a silent banner. His massive frame blocked the doorway as Silas barked orders. "Bring him out, woman!" Joanne stepped forward. "He's under my protection. Leave now, or face justice." Her voice trembled but did not break. Silas sneered and raised his rifle. In the tense split second before he could fire, Kokum closed the distance with astonishing speed. He caught Silas's wrist, twisting the rifle aside, and pinned him against the doorframe. The henchmen hesitated, caught between loyalty to their master and the undeniable presence of the warrior. Kokum studied Silas's face, eyes hard as flint. Then he released him, stepping back. "No more violence," he intoned. "Let mercy guide us." Silas, chest heaving, stared at the warrior and the veil. Humiliated, he spat in the dirt but did not retaliate. His men lowered their rifles. In that crucible of confrontation, Joanne and Kokum stood unbroken, proof that the impossible could be protected by a bond stronger than fear. Dawn's pale light filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Eliza's chapel as Joanne led Kokum down the center aisle. The wooden pews were empty, but the hush inside felt heavier than any crowd's roar. Word had reached Father Mendez that the seamstress who freed the giant Apache intended to present him for absolution, a symbolic act that could sway public opinion. They stopped before the altar, where candles flickered beside a simple crucifix. Father Mendez, robed in white vestments, peered over his spectacles, concern etched in his lined face. Behind him stood Sister Agnes, clutching a leather-bound Bible. "Joanne Dawson," he began, voice echoing against stone, "this place is consecrated to worship. Why bring a man of war here?" Joanne met his gaze steadily. "Because he was judged unjustly, Father. I ask you to judge his heart, not the lies that bound him." Kokum knelt on the stone floor, his massive frame folded like a giant child. He bowed his head, the white veil pooled at his feet like a halo. The chapel felt impossibly small around him, yet his spirit filled every corner. Father Mendez exchanged a glance with Sister Agnes. "Reveal your truth, Kokum," he intoned. "Speak, so all who gather, even those who fear you, may hear your soul." Kokum rose slowly, voice deep and resonant. "I sought only to protect what I loved, my village, my people. But when false hands bound me, they robbed me of justice. This woman showed me mercy when none remained. I stand here to confess not bloodshed, but my sorrow for those I could not save." His words hung in the silence. The flicker of candlelight danced across his scarred shoulders and the white silk at his chest. Joanne felt her breath catch as she saw tears glisten in his dark eyes. Father Mendez rested a hand on Kokum's shoulder. "May the Lord forgive your pain and grant you peace." He raised a small silver chalice. "Kokum Thayeta, by this sacrament you are free in God's sight. Go forth in faith and charity." He poured a drop of holy water over Kokum's bowed head. The chapel bells tolled in the distance, a single, sonorous peal for redemption. Outside, townsfolk gathered at the arched doorway, farmers, merchants, children, drawn by curiosity and the promise of hope. As Father Mendez pronounced the final blessing, Joanne stepped forward and wrapped the wedding veil around Kokum's neck once more. The silk glowed softly in the colored light. She whispered, "You are truly reborn." Outside, the crowd parted. their murmurs shifting from fear to wonder. In that sacred moment, the line between outcast and beloved dissolved. The giant Apache, once caged, then tended, now baptized in mercy, stood upright beneath the vaulted ceiling, a living testament that judgment, when tempered by compassion, could lead even the fallen toward grace. Before the sun had fully risen, the stillness of the chapel was shattered by frantic pounding on the heavy wooden doors. Silas Creedy's voice boomed through the stone walls. "Release him, Father. That beast belongs in iron, not in your sanctuary." Joanne and Kokum exchanged tense glances. Outside they could hear the mounting clamor of Creedy's men rallying behind him, voices calling for blood and vengeance. Joanne gripped the veil at her waist. "We cannot let them undo what we've earned." Kokum's gaze hardened. "I will answer violence with justice," he declared. He rose, the white veil slipping from his chest and pooling at his feet like a banner of defiance. They stepped into the chapel doorway together. Outside, Creedy stood flanked by armed cowhands, their rifles leveled at Kokum's broad shoulders. The rancher sneered. "This ends now, Apache. You either submit or die." A hush fell over the gathered townsfolk as Kokum advanced, each step measured and unhurried. Joanne stood at his side, voice ringing clear. "He's been judged and forgiven. Your threat is hollow." Silas spat onto the dusty ground. He raised his rifle and fired. A single, deafening crack. Before the echo died, Kokum closed the distance with astonishing speed, catching the barrel mid-recoil. The weapon's thunderous report became a pitiful snap as he wrenched it aside and pushed Silas to his knees. The cowhands hesitated, rifles trembling in their hands. Kokum surveyed them with calm authority. "Lay down your weapons," he commanded. "Justice is not vengeance." One by one, the rifles dropped, clattering against the chapel steps. Creedy glared up from the dirt, eyes burning with humiliation and rage. "You'll pay for this," he snarled. Joanne rushed forward, placing a steady hand on Kokum's arm. "No," she said softly. "He will answer for his crimes before the law." Turning to the sheriff, who had arrived at the commotion, she spoke with calm authority. "Arrest him." He forced a verdict outside the law. The sheriff, a tall man in a dust-streaked uniform, nodded gravely. He motioned his deputies and they moved in to secure Silas Creedy in iron shackles. The crowd parted, murmurs of awe and relief sweeping through them. As the deputies marched the defeated rancher away, Kokum retrieved the wedding veil from the steps, draping it once more across Joanne's shoulders as if to shield her from the dawn's harsh light. The silk gleamed softly in the early morning sun. Joanne met Kokum's gaze. "You stood for mercy even when they demanded blood." He bowed his head, voice low but firm. "Mercy tempered by justice is the greatest strength." In that moment, fury gave way to justice. Not violence for its own sake, but the triumph of mercy upheld by law. The giant Apache stood victorious, not as a savage monster, but as a champion of righteousness, bound to Joanne by the fragile silk of her husband's veil. The aftermath of the confrontation left the chapel steps littered with spent bullets and dropped rifles. As the sun climbed higher, its rays revealed a scene transformed. Where once fear held sway, now wonder and respect took root. Joanne and Kokum stood side by side, the veil fluttering between them like a silent prayer. The townsfolk, farmers, merchants, children, began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the promise of hope. They formed a hesitant circle around the pair, whispers passing from lip to lip. "Is it true what they say?" one asked. "That this seamstress bought a warrior's freedom?" another wondered. Kokum lifted a hand in greeting, his massive fingers brushing the white silk. "I came here as a prisoner," he said, voice clear and resonant, but she saw beyond the iron bars. In her eyes, I was a man, worthy of mercy. Today I stand free by her side, and I will never forget the gift she gave me. A murmur of approval swept through the crowd. An elderly farmer stepped forward, offering a battered hat in respect. A young boy, eyes wide with awe, bowed and touched the veil before scurrying back to his mother. Joanne smiled, her heart swelling as she watched a community begin to heal its wounds. Together, they led Kokum through the village, past sun-bleached buildings and wells where women fetched water. At each turn, he nodded in gratitude to those who had once spat insults but now offered silent blessings. Children chased after them, tugging at his coat, asking questions in earnest curiosity rather than fear. They arrived at the edge of town, where the dusty roads stretched toward the open plains. Joanne turned to Kokum, lifting the veil from her shoulders to wrap it around his neck like a cloak. "This veil," she said softly, "is more than cloth. It's a promise of kindness, of protection, of faith." He brushed the silk gently, his jaw firm. "It reminds me how a single act of mercy can change a life," he replied, "and how justice, when guided by compassion, can bind a community stronger than any law." They paused as a soft breeze picked up, carrying the veil aloft. The white fabric caught the light, glowing like a beacon. In its folds, the story of two unlikely allies was written, a tale of fear turned to trust, of wounds healed by empathy, and of a bond unbroken by steel or hatred. As they set out down the road together, the seamstress and the warrior, the veil trailed behind them, a living symbol of hope. Over the hill, the plains beckoned with endless possibility, and in the hearts of those they left behind, the legend of the giant Apache and the woman who wrapped him in her wedding veil would endure for generations to come. In every thread of kindness we weave, there lies the power to mend more than wounds. It can transform fear into trust and strangers into family. If this story of mercy and justice moved you, share your thoughts below and join our journey by subscribing to Frontier Miracles for more tales that prove compassion always lights the way.